Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
The GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. I have felt fairly stressed this week, just in my personal life, on top of all of the other stress that is going on in the world around us right now, the stressors that we all share with COVID-19 and figuring out what this new world looks like as all of the kids go back to school, whether that be virtually or otherwise. And I bet if you're listening today that there are a lot of you out there who, like me, felt pretty overwhelmed this last week. And so that got me thinking about different types of self-care strategies. Perhaps some that I would not normally think to try on my own. And that reminded me of sensory deprivation tanks. If you're not familiar with sensory deprivation tanks, they are these isolation tanks that you lay down in, and it cuts off all of the light and sounds that you would normally be able to sense and perceive. And it's supposed to help you out in several different ways. I've never tried this myself, but I have had some friends try it, and they really enjoyed it. So I wanted to dig into the science of that and learn a little bit more about those today. So we're going to talk about sensory deprivation theory, sensory deprivation tanks in and of themselves, so what they are and how they work. And then we're also going to talk about the risks and benefits of it. Should we use it, and is it efficacious? Per usual, we're going to start out with the science and a bit of history of these sensory deprivation tanks or isolation tanks. So these were first really created in 1954 by a neurophysiologist named John C. Lilly, and he worked at the National Institute of Mental Health. Now, the reason he created this was because Lilly wanted to study how the consciousness normally is, its origins as well, by cutting off all of the external stimuli. So what is the human consciousness on its own when deprived of these senses? And he was very interested in consciousness all the way around. He started with these sensory deprivation tanks, and then in the 60s, he was also experimenting with sensory deprivation while also taking LSD or ketamine. LSD is a hallucinogenic, so it's going to make you hallucinate a little bit. And we'll talk later on about how sensory deprivation tanks have been found in and of themselves without the aid of any other hallucinogenic compounds to cause some types of hallucinations. Ketamine is what we think of as being horse tranquilizers or cat tranquilizers, and it's a fast-acting anesthetic, so it can create a trance-like state, and it also acts as a sedative. And Lilly really wanted to know what would happen if you took these compounds while you were in a sensory deprivation tank. What would your consciousness be like? How would it be affected? So his overall focus is how the human brain works and what its experience is if it is separated from any external stimuli. He wants to know about the human consciousness. So Lilly was also inspired by the work of psychologist Donald Hebb, and he did isolation experiments too, particularly as that related to whether the brain was dependent on constantly receiving stimulation from the environment. So in Donald Hebb's research, they found that without having the stimulation, those sensory regions of your brain start to just handle themselves. So they might produce hallucinations, whether auditory or visual. And Hebb considered these to be psychopathological, like he thought they were kind of problematic. But Lilly thought that these were normal mental processes, just from an expanded point of view. So he's talking about recreational mind expansion, essentially, and that's probably what also led him into exploring this with LSD and ketamine later on. So he thought these were natural. And the tank is for self-observation or introspection in an experimental way. And in that process, he also found there were spiritual experiences from his perspective. And he talks about that in his books called The Center of the Cyclone and The Deep Self. So if you're interested in reading more about that, go for it. And these books were very intriguing to the scientific community, but particularly to the New Age community. And that's partly because one of the issues with certain types of psychological studies, and especially those relating to consciousness, is the fact that it's all introspection. So it's really difficult to say, hey, this was my subjective experience and now I'm going to apply it to everyone else. The applicability is limited because of the lack of objectivity. Now, with the advent of technology that allows us to observe people's brain waves and other neuroscientific research tools have really helped to bridge some of those gaps. So you can still have that subjective report, and you can also have a more objective or empirical type of data in the form of those brain waves, which are easier to measure against other people's. You can also create a type of rating form, so like the Beck Depression Index, because depression is individually experienced. Although lots of people may have their own experiences with depression, they are internal and subjective. So you have people who are high functioning and depressed, and people who aren't as high functioning and depressed. And it's a lot more obvious how depressed someone is if they aren't high functioning. But that doesn't mean that the high functioning people are not experiencing a significant amount of distress in their own personal lives. In anthropology, there's this concept of historical particularism, which is meant to be used when examining different cultures. And it's saying, hey, you can't really compare this culture to this culture because although they're both human cultures, this is apples and oranges. They may both be fruit, but they're very different. You can't necessarily draw super close correlations between them because it wouldn't really make sense contextually. Historical particularism says that the context does matter and that it's more important to weigh this culture against itself and its particular history and measure it that way rather than against this other culture. That each culture is best understood by looking at its own particular history. So it's saying that, essentially, history is kind of relative contextually. And similarly, suffering is also relative. We've talked about that in the past as it relates to Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, he talks about not only how suffering is relative, but that different people perceive other suffering differently. that our suffering is determined by our particular experiences, and the degree or magnitude that we feel we're experiencing our suffering is relative in to itself. So it depends on our own particular histories. One person's 10 is another person's 2, but also one person's 2 can be another person's 2, or one person's 10 can be another person's 10, but they may present differently due to their own personalities and their culture that they grew up in, or the household that they grew up in, and how the folks around them shaped their responses to suffering. And I think the same thing really applies to depression. Someone can be very depressed, just as depressed as the next person literally next to them who has done the Beck Depression Index and said, hey, this is how I'm feeling right now on this index, on these Likert scales. I am at a 5 out of 5 right now. I am deeply depressed and upset, but it may be more apparent in one person than the other. And there are so many different factors that affect that. And because we have these particular histories and all of the subjectivity in it, these indices can be very helpful when we are doing self-exploration with a licensed counselor or psychologist. It just helps to standardize the data and also get a real gauge of where each individual feels that they are in a framework that makes sense to both the person trying to help them and to any researchers who may be studying it, as well as actually to the patient themselves. So sensory deprivation theory and sensory deprivation studies have been around for quite a while, beginning with that tank in 1954 by Lilly, and followed by the creation of commercial tanks in the 70s, where people started making these and using them to study possible health benefits. Nowadays, we see them everywhere, but for a while they briefly just disappeared. And by briefly, I mean for a few decades. These sensory deprivation tanks became associated with the New Age movement for quite a while, and now we're seeing a return of them. Folks think that the potential benefits may be muscle relaxation, improvement in your sleep, decreases in pain, and decreases in your stress and anxiety levels. So we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about what these sensory deprivation chambers are and how these tanks work. Stay tuned.
Are you looking to learn more about the latest trends from the fitness world? Are you confused by all of the different trends that are out there? The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place for you. The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place to come for people of all skill and interest levels. Join us as we explore the latest trends in the fitness world. Does that new exercise really work? Should I try yoga? Whatever your question, chances are good you'll find an answer on the GSMC Fitness Podcast.
Talking about the history of sensory deprivation tanks. Invented in 1954 by Dr. Lilly, they were really popular for several years and then declined in use, only to re-emerge here recently. So now we're going to talk about what specifically these are nowadays and how they work. So first up, what do we call these? Well, some people refer to them as being sensory deprivation tanks, but that is a mouthful. Others refer to it as a flotation tank, a float tank, isolation tank, or a restricted environmental stimulation therapy tank. They call it a REST tank for short. But regardless of what you call it, these are soundproof tanks that have no light in them either, and it's partially filled about a foot deep with salt water and then heated to your outer skin temperature. So they're about 98 degrees, and they are also filled with either Epsom salt or salt water to promote buoyancy. So what do people use these for? Well, the primary goal is to reduce external stimulation, particularly sound, touch, and light. So by having all that salt water, it's just going to make you float more than you normally would. It makes it, in fact, extremely buoyant, and you will float quite easily. They say that you would actually have trouble trying to turn over onto your side or float face down on your stomach. So they claim that there's a reduced risk of drowning as well. The water is warm, so it's supposed to help you feel more like you're in a womb environment, or that the water is an extension of yourself. Since you're floating, you're not feeling any of the pressure on your body from lying down. You're not feeling any pressure points where your body is coming in contact with a floor or a bed or something like that. It just feels like you're back in the womb. Now your head does get partially submerged in these, so a lot of folks do wear earplugs along with it. And you want to make sure that you're not touching the walls, the floor, or the roof of the tank when you are fully stretched out. You should be able to have a full range of body movements and not touch the floor, the roof, or any other part of the tank. Now remember, this is only about a foot deep or so you are going to be able to reach down if you want and touch the bottom of the floor. It's not so deep that it has any risk of you being in the deep end of a pool, like 6 feet deep or something like that, which might not be that deep for some of you, but I'm 5'2", so a 6 foot deep pool is enough for me to be totally submerged. But you would be able to just sit up in this if you felt the need to and be just fine. But in order to achieve your goal of sensory deprivation, you want to try not to touch the walls, the floor, or the roof of this tank. And then without these external stimuli, without being able to feel the pressure of the bed or the floor underneath you because you're floating, it's supposed to help relax your muscles. And without the stimuli of being able to hear things or see things, it's supposed to give you an overall feeling of total relaxation. Regulations for how these tanks are used and cleaned, etc., just depend on where you are. They generally keep it clean by, first of all, having the saline waters. Bacteria does not generally grow very well in very salty waters. And so that's already a preventive measure in and of itself. So that salt water serves several purposes. One is sanitation and another is flotation. Also, other hygiene measures may be implemented to help make sure that everyone is having as sanitary of a time as they can when you are floating in water someone else is in. Now, this might sound gross at first, but remember, we all grew up going to, hot tubs or swimming in the creek or the lake together or swimming in the pools. So in those cases, you are sharing this water with other people. And oftentimes they were just pumping chlorine into it, or in the case of lakes and rivers, nothing at all to help ensure that hygiene. So this isn't that weird, in my opinion. But to help keep it clean, they want all people to shower prior to entering the tank. You're still wearing swim trunks or something generally, but still shower before you get in the tank. And then the entire saltwater solution that they use is supposed to generally be filtered 3 times between the float sessions, and some places entirely replace the water completely after about 1,000 sessions, which is generally roughly 6 months. So that entire tank is disinfected using a combination of ultraviolet light and bromine or sometimes chlorine, just depending on the specific tank and where you are. They also regularly physically clean the tank's interior surfaces, so physically cleaning it like scrubbing it, etc. Now when I'm talking about these, I'm talking about public tanks. So there are commercial flotation tank facilities, like we discussed earlier, that started in the 70s and are re-emerging now, but some folks actually have their own private household flotation tanks, which is a little mind-boggling to me. It's up there with perhaps having your own tanning bed in your home. Like, I've known people who've done these things, but it's not entirely common in my experience. So it's still a little odd, but some folks do have their own household flotation tanks. And in the cases of those, there's no regulations for those. So that is up to you how often you clean them. But I do encourage you to check out the best practices for that. So now that we know what these are and how they are cleaned, well, how do they exactly work? What do you do in these? Well, you just get in there and you lie down. It sounds very simple, but it's pretty much just an hour of you time, but also by cutting off all these external stimuli, so it's just you, as in your consciousness. It's taking away those sensory experiences. So really, if you strip it all down, it's just you alone with you in a tank for about 60 to 90 minutes. Although you can get out early if you feel the need to. They're not trying to trap you in there. So if you feel claustrophobic, maybe talk that over with your therapist first or your doctor before you go in there. But you are able to get out of that hatch at any time. But if you're not claustrophobic and you are an introvert or just anyone who needs some time to reconnect with themselves, it might be a good idea for you. As an introvert, I find this to be rather appealing. I like the idea of being able to just be alone in the quiet and the dark, floating. I am a water baby and will spend as much time as is actually allowed of me in the water, whether that is a bath or a hot tub or one of my personal favorites, the lazy river. I love those. I love lazy river wave pools. Those are just very chill. I love being on boats. It is just very nice and soothing in my personal experience and opinion. So I really like this idea of sensory deprivation tanks, although I have yet to try one. Now, my ex-boyfriend Roger and one of our very best friends, Michael, got each other these sensory deprivation tank experiences for Christmas like a year or so ago, and they went into these tanks separately. You're not supposed to be with another person, and had their own experiences. And they were looking to perform some introspection and get in touch with more of their creativity, as a lot of people have said that these tanks really help you let loose with your creativity. Now, they're both very creative people, but they wanted to see if this was perhaps a new type of stimulus for their creativity. And they both really enjoyed it. They came back home super relaxed, a little wet still. They had their towels in the car with them and everything, but they were still a little damp. And they had a wonderful time. They were really chill for the rest of the evening and just really happy, and also had some great creative bursts in there. Also, since you are in this tank with water, you don't have your phone on you, so you don't have any distractions. I think that phrasing it as being cut off from external stimuli might sound a little scary to some people. So maybe think of it as being more of not being caught up with other distractions. You aren't having a phone or any type of screen in front of you. There are no kids trying to come into the bathroom while you are trying to use the bathroom and just have a moment of peace. There's nothing like that. it's very, very quiet and very much, almost seemingly the ideal alone time. If you are a fan of alone time, I understand that this might not be for everyone, and if you're super extroverted, this might sound like your personal nightmare. But overall, a lot of people have tried it over the years and have really liked it. They found it to be super soothing and have said that it's made them happy throughout the day, that it's kind of like a massage in that way, in which you kind of have this body high for the rest of the day and you just feel lighter and more relaxed and like your stress has really been reduced. Now, that is subjective, but we are going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to take a look at some scientific articles regarding the outcomes and effectiveness of sensory deprivation tanks. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Before the break, we were talking about what sensory deprivation tanks are and how they work and are cleaned. Now we're going to talk about some scientific studies of these tanks. Subjective experience is one thing, and it is valuable in its own right. But scientific studies can also tell us a bit more about what these treatments are and how they really work outside of our very human biases. This article is called Beneficial Effects of Treatment with Sensory Isolation in Flotation Tank as a Preventive Healthcare Intervention, a randomized controlled pilot trial. And this is by Kjellgren and Westman, 2014, in the journal BMC Complementary Alternative Medicine. So we know from this title off the bat that it has a randomized controlled trial of a study in it. And you know how I love my randomized controlled trials. So in this situation, they use sensory isolation in a flotation tank with 65 participants. Interestingly, 14 were men and 51 of them were women. And all of these people were part of a cooperative health project that was started by their individual companies that they worked for. So they were randomized either to be part of a waitlist control group or the flotation tank treatment group. And if you're in the flotation tank treatment group, you participated in 7 weeks of flotation programs. And in that 7 weeks, you have a total of 12 flotation sessions. To measure whether or not this worked or what the effects were in general, they gave them questionnaires. So remember that Beck Depression Index that we discussed earlier? Kind of like that. And these questionnaires asked about their psychological and physiological responses, and also just how they were beforehand too. So how were their stress and energy levels? Did they feel depressed or anxious, optimistic? How much pain and stress were they undergoing? what was their general sleep quality beforehand, as well as their mindfulness, and also the degree of altered states of consciousness. Then they analyzed that data using some statistical programs. If you're really interested in statistics, they specifically use repeated measures ANOVA and a two-way mixed MANOVA. And really what these are telling you is how much variance is between these responses. So they have 65 participants, so that's well above that 30 for the golden rule of statistical significance. So they had a good amount of people, and they wanted to see how much their responses varied from each other. So that's all ANOVA really means, is an analysis of variance. So they're just kind of putting these people in these tanks in these 12 separate sessions over a period of 7 weeks, and then saying, hey, how do you feel before and after? Fill out this questionnaire and let us know how you feel. And then they analyze the variance between those to see how similar these subjective individual experiences were to each other, and also how different. They found that stress, depression, anxiety, and pain were decreased, while optimism and sleep quality significantly increased for the flotation rest group. But they did not see any significant results for the control group, who were the people anticipating to get to do the flotation rest therapy, but they were just on the wait list. They also had a significant correlation between mindfulness in their daily life and the degree of altered states of consciousness during their relaxation periods within the sensory deprivation tanks. So overall, the authors found that the flotation rest therapy had beneficial effects on people who were relatively healthy and participated in the actual flotation sessions. Now, their main point of this was viewing it as a preventive measure for healthcare and overall wellness. In the United States, a lot of times we primarily have sick care. So we go to the doctor when we don't feel well, and the rest of the time we're not focusing that much on how our bodies feel or our minds and what these aspects of who we are as people are trying to really communicate with us. So normally, sensory deprivation tanks or sensory isolation in these flotation tanks are used to just overall help you feel more relaxed and help relieve stress and muscle tension. But they aren't often used as a preventive measure. People only go to them when they are already, stressed out or they're sore and they need to relax. So the theory behind this, or the hypothesis behind this, is that it could be used regularly to maintain low levels of stress and low levels of pain, and thereby also decrease the amount of time that people use for sick leave and overall have better health. So this seems to be coming from wellness initiatives that these people, the participants, were already enrolled in through their work, and they wanted to see how effective it really is, whether this is something the company should invest in as a wellness initiative to prevent having to deal with more sick care and paying out more for the health care benefits of employees. If you're able to maintain a certain level of wellness, perhaps that ounce of prevention really will be worth that pound of cure. So the study was conducted with the Australian-New Zealand Clinical Trials Registry. So this was a clinical trial, and it has a registration number through there. And I found it really interesting that they stated in their literature review that stress-related ill health, like issues with anxiety or depression and not getting a lot of sleep, are common reasons for sick leave absences from work in Australia. Now, the articles that they cited, though, were from the American Journal of Industrial Medicine and a book on musculoskeletal pain. However, they also looked at stress in the workplace and how that impacted calling into work and overall job burnout. They looked at 3 or 4 articles in that regard as well, including one called Need for Recovery from Work-Related Fatigue and its Role in the Development and Prediction of Subjective Health Complaints, and another on sickness absence as a risk factor for job termination, unemployment, and disability pension amongst both temporary and permanent employees. Now, as a former manager in the U.S., I will say that one of the most difficult things to get people to take time off from work for is their mental health. A lot of us put that on the back burner, partly because we don't have a lot of mental health coverage that's of decent quality at all in our workplaces, but also because if you're going to call out of work, you're losing money a lot of the time. Most people aren't salaried, and so it's really difficult to call out for that. Also, our toxic work culture often leads to folks just continuing to work even if they are sick and even if they are salaried, because there's this concept that if you work hard enough and you really give everything your all and you stay late, etc., then the company is really going to recognize it. And I'm sure that some do, but many don't. And so a lot of Americans don't take their full paid benefits. They don't take their leave. They don't take their sick days if they have paid sick days. So the company gets to just keep that money and also keep their workers. So it's really only benefiting the company in that way and not individuals. As the authors of this particular article point out, you do indeed get burnout from your job that's related to your stress, and it kind of reinforces the other one. It's a positive feedback cycle. The more stressed you are, the more likely you are to start experiencing job burnout. And if you're experiencing job burnout, then that stress can lead to other areas of your life and just turn you into a snowball of stress that just keeps on rolling. So that was something I was always very upfront with the people who were on my team. So if they said, hey, I am feeling burnout, I always told them, you can come to me at any time and tell me that you're feeling burnout, and you don't have to explain anything beyond that if you don't want to, and we can find you a 3-day weekend or some form of extended leave to help you figure out what's going on, to help you relax if nothing else. Like, don't look at your computer, don't try to pick up a shift. I know it's easy when you work from home to just go, I'm not doing anything, I might as well do this. I don't even have to put on pants to go into work. But that can result in burnout. And so these authors found that you could reduce a lot of that stress and help reduce that cycle of stress feeding into job burnout and requiring you to take more sick leave if the office offered this type of wellness method. So I've worked for a couple companies over the years, and some of them have tried their own brand of wellness, but normally, in my experience, they've tried to do it by not paying any money at all. Sometimes they'll pay a little bit of money, and other times they are essentially trying to get something for nothing, at least in my experience. So it's really important for them to take this empirical look at the data and see what works and what doesn't. I'm also just down for the subjectivity. I've seen my friends anecdotally come back from these flotation tank sessions and feel very happy and more relaxed than I had seen them in a while. And that includes someone I lived with every day and another person that I saw like 3 times a week or more each week. So these are people I was very familiar with and who we're very open with each other with our pain and distress and also our wins. So it was a very striking difference even to see them that happy and that relaxed following their time in the sensory deprivation tanks. And in addition to that anecdote, we have articles like this that show us that flotation rest may reduce contributing factors to stress-related illnesses and also increase psychological factors that are positive in healthy participants, like helping them to feel more optimistic. And remember from our previous episodes that when you feel more optimistic, you are actually healthier. People who are overall more optimistic report better health outcomes and less stress. And that in and of itself, even though I am a die-hard realist, is enough to push me to go, hey, maybe I should be trying to be more optimistic. Because that's about as real as it gets, right? Having this science saying, hey, if you're optimistic, you would be healthier. The realist in me is going, hey, maybe I should be optimistic if it's going to help with my own health and wellness. That seems pragmatic to me. The overall conclusion for this is that stress, anxiety, depression, and pain decreased, and the sleep quality and optimism improved in that flotation rest group when compared to the control group, who unfortunately didn't get to participate in it, but were anticipating that they would get to go on it because of the wait list. Now, that technique might increase general health and thereby perhaps also prevent the need for a lot of future sick leave. Obviously, not all of it. Going in a sensory deprivation tank isn't necessarily going to stop you from getting the flu or strep throat or anything like that, but it could help with the stress-related features or the mental health-related features that are related to things like depression and anxiety and not getting enough good quality sleep. So this can help with your mental health and your physical health and your emotional wellness, but also your financial wellness if you're not having to miss work. And the pro of that is even if you are using sick days or these paid leave days to cover your absences, if you're not having to use them when you feel sick or stressed or you just need a mental health day, then you're able to keep the money that you would have been getting normally by being able to go to work, and then also using those days for holidays or vacations, even if it's a staycation where you're just at home. Being able to have that time off and not having to worry about work, but also not having your body and mind stressed from being ill can be very rejuvenating and, in my personal opinion, is very underrated. I was one of those people who did not use their vacation days very frequently, or if I did, since I work from home, I would work from my hotel, and I would still go and travel to the places I needed to be for conferences that were related to my other work, and not that particular job, while also doing that job. It was a lot. It was way too much, and I was caught up in that rat race. But you can be very successful and also very well respected at work without running yourself into the ground. And if your job doesn't allow for that, then that job place is probably fairly toxic. And maybe you could use a rest in a sensory deprivation tank. Now, this article did not say whether or not this flotation rest session has positive effects on reducing sick leave. They want to evaluate that with future research, but they did find that the data overwhelmingly showed that folks were getting these positive impacts from it, and that was over a 7-week period of once or twice a week. So it was 12 sessions spread over that 7-week period. So check it out if you think it might be right for you. And we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the risks and any side effects that may be associated with this so you can make an informed opinion about whether or not this is something you might want to try in your personal health and wellness journey. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Break, we were discussing sensory deprivation tank therapy and how that is effective according to some scientific studies. Now we know that they have found that it is likely to also be helpful in preventing you from getting too stressed to begin with by essentially taking time for self-care. It's an extreme form of self-care, perhaps, depending on your point of view. But by going to 12 different flotation sessions over a period of 7 weeks, they did find a significant difference between the folks who participated in the sessions and those who were in the control group, which was a wait list. Those folks had lowered anxiety and depression levels, improved sleep, and increased optimism, as well as a reduction in overall pain. So, now I want to talk about the actual risks associated with this. We know that there are some potential benefits that have scientific backing behind them as well, and that they can allegedly help boost creativity, according to a study from 2014, and also possibly improve physical performance, according to a study in 2016. So that supports that whole mind-body connection and the holistic nature of health and wellness too. And that 2016 study also did note that those results were preliminary and that additional research is necessary. And you guys know how much I love honest limitations of studies. So they were very honest about that, just like the 2014 study that we mentioned in the previous segment, and are saying, hey, these are our preliminary results, but in order to tell if this is super efficacious, we're getting the things, the outcomes that we are intending to get with this, we need to have some more research and some validation studies too. So I'm very much for that. That makes me feel more supportive of these studies when they're able to admit, hey, this is just one study, let's keep looking at it and grow this body of research together. They also say that it could help with anxiety, depression, and pain reduction, as that 2014 study showed us. But also, there was research in a 2018 study, which was a little small, but they did find that sensory deprivation therapy helped improve symptoms of anxiety and depression. They did also admit that they need larger studies to confirm those effects. So again, being honest with the limitations lends credence, in my opinion. Although there are a lot of anecdotal and even scientific studies and evidence that say, yes, this is effective, there may also be some caveats to it. The main thing that I noticed when I was reading this information on flotation tanks this past week is that a lot of folks specifically said that these are outcomes in healthy individuals or relatively healthy individuals. So most of the participants in these have been in relatively good health, and therefore when they're saying there are limited risks, that's specifically for people who are in relatively good health. There may be more dangers if you're not. So for example, Some folks have said they've experienced hallucinations in the tank. And those hallucinations have been both auditory and visual, just depending upon the person. And according to researchers, it only takes 15 minutes of sensory deprivation to start getting vivid hallucinations. So remember, in these sensory deprivation tanks, you are not able to see and you're really not able to hear. A lot of folks in the tanks also use earplugs in addition to the natural sound dampening that's occurring inside of this closed container. In a recent study, a researcher named Oliver Mason headed the study at the University College of London, and they placed 19 volunteers in a sensory deprivation room. So the room was soundproof and lightproof. It wasn't necessarily the sensory deprivation tank, but it's still sensory deprivation in and of itself. And in this experience, the participants said they had perceptual disturbances, paranoia, and anhedonia. We've discussed anhedonia briefly in previous episodes, and that's the inability to feel pleasure. And that took place after just 15 minutes of having their senses deprived. Now, why is this important? Well, all of these things that they were experiencing after just those 15 minutes are part of psychosis that we believed 50 years ago could be induced by sensory starvation. And this supports that theory. So it's actually a really important finding, even though for a lot of us it's like, oh, okay, well, this is just wellness. But it's not just that. It's also indicating that sensory patterns are important in the human experience for our environment if we at least are born able to experience those. And that when we don't have those sensory patterns in the environment, we tend to create our own patterns. Our consciousness is creating these perceptual disturbances and this feeling of paranoia, and it's dampening our ability to feel pleasure and just keeping people kind of on edge. Now, that's not to say that all folks may be on edge, but the fact is some people do feel less than relaxed when it comes to sensory deprivation. So this study found that the brain really needs those sensory patterns, and it'll create their own when none are available. And they think that the hallucinations are a part of faulty source monitoring. That's where your brain is getting confused about the source of the sensory input. And I find that very fascinating from taking sensation and perception courses in psychology when I was in college and captioning classes for students of the deaf community. It was a very intriguing class to participate in with someone who had such a different sensory experience from my own. And speaking with the students I worked with was very enlightening. And it makes a lot of sense with this faulty source monitoring too. Sensory deprivation has also been used as a form of torture. So for everyone, it's going to be a mixed bag. This is not something that's necessarily going to work great for everyone. If you're claustrophobic, or if you have trouble being with your own thoughts or hearing your blood rushing through your ears and such, then this might not be for you. They refer to this as being white torture, and that means long-term isolation that results in the person who's being detained to lose their sense of personal identity. Now, that doesn't mean that all sensory deprivation will be negative. A lot of folks are happy with the relaxation and meditation, but if you're not happy being alone or in silence or in the dark, then this may very well not be for you. And that is absolutely okay. We are all on our individual fitness journeys and our wellness journeys, and it's important to understand that even when we are recommending things to our friends, that it might not necessarily be for them either. And that's okay. One thing that could be life-changing for you may be absolutely nightmarish for someone else. And it's important to back off a little bit when we are putting forward these solutions. There was also a 2015 study in which researchers split up participants into groups based on how prone they were to hallucinations. And they were in 2 groups, and they found that the folks who had said they were more likely to hallucinate did have more hallucinations than those in the other group while they were in the sensory deprivation chamber. If you do experience hallucinations in the tank, they typically tend to stop once you leave the tank. If they don't stop at that point, then you definitely need to reach out to a healthcare provider so that you can get some assistance with what's going on there, because that is considered to be abnormal. But hallucinations inside the tank are relatively common for people who feel they're already more likely to hallucinate. Now, if you're worried about drowning, technically you can drown in very small units of water, but in the flotation tank, although there's enough water in there for you to technically drown, it's very rare for that type of accident to occur. As we discussed earlier, it's hard for you to roll over onto your side or even try to float face down in the tank. In addition to it being inadvisable, you aren't supposed to be trying to do that either, but it's hard to do that because the buoyancy is extreme and the water's about a foot deep. So the best way to prevent that, though, is to make sure you're not going into the tank while you're high or intoxicated in any other way. This is going to offer you some mind expansion on its own and some relaxation on its own without the aid of drugs. And even if Dr. Lilly did also explore the use of recreational mind expansion drugs in combination with these tanks back in the 60s, it's just not advisable to be trying to do this while you are under the influence. The TLDR of this is that as long as you are sober and safe, you should be able to go into these tanks on your own and be just fine. Most people with a good health status should be able to tolerate that experience and not have a lot of risks. This is still considered to be a complementary and alternative medicine though, so it is a CAM, and that's totally fine, but just like other CAMs, you want to make sure that you're not using this to replace any type of actual treatment that your doctor may have prescribed. Also talk to your doctor about it if you're considering adding this to your routine for your health and your wellness, because it very well may coincide with a change in medication or something else like that. And they want to make sure that they can keep an eye on all of the variables and see what's truly helping you to do better, to really be that partner in your health and wellness journey. Now, regarding excess risks, there are certain people who should not use these, and that's people under age 16 and folks who have certain medical conditions. Also, you should not go into the tank if you've just shaven or if you are sunburnt, because that high salt concentration can cause a lot of stinging and discomfort. They also recommend not going in there if you are currently menstruating. They don't specify why, but I suppose it's a sanitation issue. Now, they also say that if you have certain conditions, you should not go in there, and that includes epilepsy, low blood pressure, kidney disease, any form of contagious disease, and that includes diarrheal illnesses, gastroenteritis, bacterial infections, viral infections, anything that's contagious. You shouldn't go in there while you have it or for 14 days following having had those issues. You shouldn't go in if you have open wounds or skin ulcers or claustrophobia. And if you have certain other conditions, you want to check with your doctor first. So if you're pregnant, then you need to check with your doctor first. Or if you have asthma, psychosis, any type of heart condition, skin conditions that are severe, like severe psoriasis or eczema, or if you have a sensitivity to chlorine, bromine, sulfate, or magnesium. So remember, they are putting some Epsom salts in some of these, and in our Epsom salt episode, we talked about some of the elements that are in these salts, and they also tend to clean the tanks periodically with chlorine, just depending on which tanks you happen to go to. So be mindful of that. If you have a sensitivity to any of those compounds or you have any of those conditions, then speak with your doctor first and make sure that it's something that's safe for you. Once you do get out of the tank, you might experience a heightened sense of smell, sound, and light after your floating session. It might sound really loud when you get out, or it may seem inordinately bright. If you are going in there for the first time, you might even feel nauseous. Now, your skin shouldn't start wrinkling because Epsom salts have a softening and soothing effect. They're an emollient. So if you are worried about coming out as a prune, you should be just fine. Lastly, there was recently a very interesting study by Bell et al. 2019 in the journal Neuroplasticity, and it is about sensory deprivation in your senses of space-time and how those are informed by your senses of vision and hearing. So they put folks in sensory deprivation chambers and studied this. And they found that there were some behavioral enhancements in the overtaking sense. So when they deprived someone of their sense of hearing, then they experienced an acuity in vision. And if they deprived them of their sense of sight, then they experienced a corresponding acuity in their sense of hearing. And it really depends on the processes of how this is put in place. So they mean that the regions in the brain that were used during the behavioral performance of that deprived sense also support a similar behavioral performance for the sense that's making up for that lack. So they want to do some more research on this too to see exactly how this works. And they also want to study more of the effects on neuroplasticity and also how this might affect the space-time processing in individuals of the deaf community. If you would like to check out that article, it is called The Cross-Modal Effects of Sensory Deprivation on Spatial and Temporal Processes in Vision and Audition, a systematic review on behavioral and neuroimaging research since 2000. Overall, it seems that there is a lot of scientific backing for the use of sensory deprivation chambers and sensory deprivation therapy for helping reduce stress, anxiety, and depression, and also in improving optimism and better sleep. And you could technically perhaps sleep in these. There's a relatively low risk of drowning. Some folks do sleep in them, but they recommend that you don't and that you also go in there sober, despite what the inventor, Dr. Lilly, might have had to say about that. Overall, it's supposed to be pretty relaxing and help you stay relaxed throughout the rest of the day and overall decrease your stress. So if you're feeling stressed or depressed or anxious or you're just not getting great sleep, you might want to talk to your doctor about whether this complementary and alternative medicine may be a good approach for you. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.